Okay, it looks like we're live. So, hi everybody. My name's Brandon Wilson. I'll be moderating the panel. It is officially called, let me get this right, Lessons Not Learned: The Future of Dystopian and Utopian Stories. And I thought that this was a definitely a juicy subject to talk about right now, and so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So I guess I should just sort of introduce the panel and maybe have you guys introduce yourselves very briefly. I'm gonna go, let's see, to this side of me clockwise and start with Elsa. Elsa, please tell everyone, introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Elsa Hunason. I was the guest co-editor-in-chief of Disabled People Destroy Science Fiction, which won a Hugo Award with Uncanny Magazine last year for Best Semi-Prozine. My work has been on the intersection of disability and science fiction for the last 6 years. You may have seen me working on Marvel's Jessica Jones Playing with Fire, which was produced by Serial Box, or my piece, A Place Out of Time, which is about disabled time travelers and how the world is all terrible. That's me.
Thank you. And let's see, next is, I guess, going to the circle, Christine.
Hi, I'm Christine Taylor Butler, and I'm a recovering MIT engineer who decided to chuck my corporate job so I could warp the minds of children one book at a time. And I'm most known for my science nonfiction and doing science experiments at like WorldCon and DragonCon, but also I have a middle grade YA out, the Lost Tribes series, which is what MIT calls the technical Harry Potter. So that's me.
Thank you. Next is Mari.
Hi, I'm Mari Ness. I'm primarily known for short fiction and poetry. I have a story coming out in a very apocalyptic anthology, Glitter and Ashes, this month. On top of that, I also have dabbled in a number of different fields, marine biology, travel, academia, what have you. And for the purposes of this panel, I will, since people can't actually see me, I am currently in a wheelchair. I am a wheelchair user, so I may be bringing this up in terms of disability and other things. So if I seem to get very enthusiastic about that, my three other panelists have all met me and have already had to hear me get very enthusiastic or very passionate about stuff. But I thought perhaps our audience is not. So that's a little bit of your warning nod. In addition, I also watch a lot of bad TV, which includes The 100, which I felt certainly worked with this panel, and that's me.
Thank you. And John.
Yeah, I'm John Wiswell. I'm at Wiswell on Twitter. I'm a writer mostly of short fiction. I've published now a couple dozen short stories and flashes of usually in the horror, science fiction, and fantasy genres. I think I've begun to be recognized as the guy who wants to hug monsters. I love Tentacle Beast on his first date, a tank that's become sentient and is trying to go to its first fan convention. Really just any giant killer robot that just wants a friend. Basically, if it's awful, I want to knit it a sweater. I'm also a queer writer and a disabled writer, and probably the intersection of those is when I became radicalized. And I've been writing increasingly about how those things intersect with justice, and you can't have dystopias or utopias without justice.
Well, thank you all. Thank you all so much. And just a little bit about my background. I am a filmmaker and a film professor, sort of by trade. I teach classes at UCLA, Columbia College Hollywood, and Long Beach Community College. Well, it's all online these days. I was going to say online and in person, but I actually had a leg up on online in education before everything shut down. And I kind of was just sort of curious. I came sort of with the idea for the panel. I'm not a science fiction writer, And I've written screenplays that have yet to be produced. I just finished one actually with a writing partner of mine. So I'm a lifelong science fiction nerd. One of my projects during quarantine has been Star Trek in its entirety. We just had Gene Roddenberry's 99th birthday last Saturday. So I was like, I'm going to do it. It might take me until his 100th. Fine. So I decided to start when I started with the original series, and now I'm about 3/4 through Next Generation. And of course, watching Star Trek right now is very interesting because of this, it's such a utopian, such a mid-century vision of the future. And they have always dropped hints that the period that we're in right now isn't so great, that we're going to have to go through some very dark periods before we can get to that. And of course, the whole Star Trek, as we know from where the franchise has been, the franchise is a little bit out of place these days. In some ways, the fashion has been very much to push dystopian futures, and the sort of mid-century Kennedy era, post-Kennedy era optimism obviously is clashing a bit with these times. And yet that sort of started me thinking. I mean, so much of science fiction has been about sort of dystopia, especially of late, and utopia. But obviously, I think they're sort of twin, it's two sides of the same coin, which is very interesting, right? That I think in most utopia stories and dystopia stories, as I've been sort of researching for this, there's a concept that underneath that in every utopia, there's really a dystopia just under the surface, or just one person's utopia is someone else's dystopia. And so that's something I'm sort of curious to sort of talk about and play with, and then also how, now that we are experiencing some rather dystopian circumstances in our everyday life, what do we make of this, and how is this going to impact our storytelling? So yeah, I guess that's kind of where we'll start. Is where do we go from here now that so much of, I think it seems like a lot of the warnings that we've been given in speculative fiction maybe have been somewhat ignored, or maybe you guys disagree with that. So I'll open it up. What do you guys think?
You presuppose that the people who are currently ruining the earth have actually read these books. Okay, we have been putting out the breadcrumbs forever. But those breadcrumbs are not on NBC and Fox News. And I am just fascinated that, I grew up without a lot of money. So I lived in the library, and I wanted to be out of my reality. So I was reading a lot of science fiction and horror and, but that's fantasy. And now I look around and go, well, this was more like prescient. It was, I wasn't expecting it to hit all at once in 2020 with the locusts in Africa and the idiot in the White House and the pandemic. And I'm thinking I need to build a bunker.
Yeah, I think that's we've all been thinking that to some degree, and why we wasted so much time not building a bunker. Anyone else? Anyone else have a take on that?
I think it's interesting. I live in Seattle, Washington, and we have been having, since May 30th, very intense protests, like 10 blocks. Mm-hmm. And, it is interesting to me as somebody who grew up in the generation of people who read The Hunger Games and read Harry Potter and read all of these books that were about resisting authoritarianism, resisting fascism, resisting all of these things. People my age and slightly younger, yeah, absolutely. There are people who are stepping up and doing what needs to be done. But I think the lesson that a lot of people didn't learn, because they were too focused on Katniss, they were too focused on Harry, they were too focused on Hermione, that the people who make change are not the named characters. The people who make the ones who are the boots on the ground, or for that matter, the people who are taking care of the boots on the ground. So you have, I have been out on the street, sure. I've also been working comms. I've been the person who's saying, hey, cops are over here. You might want to go that way if you're trying to escape the protest. And that's the kind of work that exists that we don't see in speculative fiction. We don't see the narrative of it's important to have safe houses, it's important to have bail funds, it's important to have these people who take care of us who are not the glorified heroes. I think that's part of what we missed.
I wanted to follow up on Christine's statement a little bit, in that I grew up very well-to-do, but I still fled to the library a lot because we moved all the time and I didn't really have friends. So my friends were books. And I had my parents telling me, no, you need to read realistic stuff. You shouldn't be reading all this fantasy, all this science fiction, all of this other stuff. You need to be reading, history. You need to also be, exercising, and you need to do your math homework and, things like that. That was frankly very boring and not what I wanted to do. But I think that in retrospect, those were the tools, because fantasy and science fiction is like, there are other possibilities. And I've had I don't want to, get over cheerful, optimistic. I'm not an optimistic person. I really am not. I'm a pessimist. But at the same time, I think the one way where I have been able to survive has been by reminding myself, hey, I hang out with people who think of alternatives. I continually read alternatives. So I would say right now, the most important thing science fiction and fantasy can offer is there are alternatives. In terms of following up on Elsa's point of smaller things, I've been planting little trees around my house. Many of them are dying because I'm not very good at this, but I'm trying. It does not necessarily make for an exciting narrative to say, yes, well, I went out, planted the tree, it plopped over dead. This is not, there's no real, this is not something that Neil Clark from Clarksville is going to say, yes, please send that to me immediately. But it can be helpful, I do think, to have this in the background and to say, yes, there are other things going around, there are other approaches. And I think that is something else that it's going to happen. I do have one more quick point to get to the original question answered. One thing I'm seeing, or original question asked, one thing that I am very much seeing is in my own fiction and also in the fiction that's being produced is, wow, we now have to incorporate, people are going to behave like idiots. The horror movie trope that nobody would do that, people are doing that. We have to incorporate masks. I have a story I'm working on right now that was started pre-quarantine, doesn't have masks. It does not work. The entire opening sequence does no longer make sense. So we are already having to incorporate changes that have happened into our fiction, and it is causing a lot of writing, rewriting, editing. And I'm not just seeing it in my fiction, I'm seeing it in some other contexts, like, as I said, the 100, which did a sudden editing change this season to incorporate, hey, we got the cause of the apocalypse wrong when we started out our show. So we now have to change this in our backstory.
It's funny you say it's changing your fiction, because it's also changing my nonfiction. I'm in the middle of writing my memoir and I had to completely restructure my book.
So I'd like to go back to something that Brandon said, and that was in the panel description itself, was the idea that dystopic fiction has not been heeded sufficiently. And I think when we get disappointed that some tidbit of 1984 resonates with something that happens now, we often ignore how much of the dystopian fiction has been averted. We had decades of nuclear holocausts in our fiction. That has not happened. The Stand has not happened. There have been terrible outbreaks of disease, but we have not wound up wiped out by that. A robotic apocalypse or a robotic enforced dystopia has wound up not coming to pass. I think we don't give ourselves enough credit both for sufficient warnings and for the incredible hard work and advocacy and watchdogs and community activism that has prevented many of the disasters that we imagined for decades to come. Mary Shelley wrote a plague novel about how we'd almost all be wiped out and be basically looked down upon by a small group of master survivors. And so I just, I guess it's funny, but I just want to give credit both to some authors whose works have been heeded and just the very many readers who have worked extremely hard to make life safer on Earth.
And also, I do want to make an acknowledgement here, which is that this is technically my second apocalypse. You know, I am a child of the AIDS pandemic. My father died in 1993 from what they call complications due to AIDS. It's just AIDS, moving on. But this is my second pandemic. It's not my first. And I think a lot of people are behaving like, oh, we weren't prepared for this. We didn't know how to do this. It's not true. The queer community does know how to do this. The queer community has survived this before. So I think it's actually important to talk about that in this context.
Yeah.
I will say that the night is still young. There's under 73,000 people dead just in this country, and one of them was my friend who was doing everything correct, and after a month died last month. And I still see people in Missouri acting like it's a hoax. And you know, because I'm an MIT nerd, you know, I pay attention to things like you know, Earth's magnetic field, and it's doing some weird stuff right now. Or the idea that I remember years ago, I told my husband, I'm going to write a short story. I don't understand short form yet, but I'm going to write a short story because of all the fracking in Oklahoma. And I said, there is going to have to be a consequence to what we are doing to, you know, the tectonic plates, and the fact that the corporations have said, hey, it's proprietary. We are not going to tell you what we're pumping into the ground, even if it's going to affect the ground water. Now that's 2 states away. You know, to get to Oklahoma City from here is, if you're going nonstop, 6-hour drive. One day, I live in a 100-year-old house with 12-inch brick walls. This thing has been around forever. And one day I'm sitting in my bed and it's going like this, and it's very surreal. And I'm going, is the cat under the bed? And I'm thinking, well, you know, a cat is not going to make this bed, which weighs several hundred pounds, roll like this. And I yelled at my husband, did you feel that? Because it was like waves. And I turn on the news. Now we're in Missouri. It's earthquakes in Oklahoma, which went from 1 earthquake every, 10 years to 100 every year. And it started with fracking. So, I'm optimistic that we have a lot of people who are reading and are starting to pay attention to this. And God bless my soul, my kids grew up on dystopian novels. So, I'm a believer, don't trust anyone, especially in the government. But I think the world's still young, because you start looking at what's happening with AI and facial recognition, and the fact that even on Airbnb, where I'm a host, our emails are being edited by bots, sometimes wrong. So I think this is one of those things where I think we are in the middle of the beginning of what could be a dystopian world, if we are not paying attention to the fact that almost all of this power is concentrated into the hands of a very small group of companies, politicians. Amazon owns everything from PillPack to your Ring doorbell. And I think there's a point in time where we used to have breaks and limits on things like that. We don't have anymore. So that's why I'm really glad we're having this discussion now, because we used to think this was all fantasy, but a lot of this stuff, if you're reading books, is starting to feel like it's a little more real than it was in the past.
So unsurprisingly, I'm about to get political. Talking about editing and the science and who gets to hold certain science. And John clearly knows where I'm going with this. There's this technology called CRISPR. And this technology called CRISPR can do this thing where you can edit genes before someone's born. And what many people want to use CRISPR for is editing disabled people out of the equation. What we should be calling this is eugenics. We should not be calling this a miracle of science. We should be calling it what it is. Now, when we talk about eugenics, it's really important to talk about how eugenics is a fundamental world-building technique for science fiction, because when we envision futures, what we're talking about are better futures. And when we do not include disabled people in those futures, what we are doing is practicing eugenics. We are saying, oh, it will be better in 50 years when we no longer have to have disabled people, because suddenly we have the science, we have the technology. You don't have to be deafblind anymore. You can just see. So when I think about these concepts of power and science, I also think about who benefits, but also who doesn't benefit. We were talking about this at the beginning. Who doesn't benefit from utopias? To many people, the idea of CRISPR is a utopian concept. It is not a utopian concept to me.
Well, that to a certain extent goes back, and I'll jump at Brandon a little bit for the Hollywood point of view, in that the majority of us have seen, and I do mean visualize, our utopias and our dystopias on screen, on television, and in film. And Hollywood very much goes for casting attractive people. So that, I mean, the Hunger Games film is really a prime example of this. But the 100 is the same way. Star Trek, everyone, especially in the original series, was drop dead gorgeous and made up to be as sexy and as hot and as skinny as possible. So we tend to have that in our minds, and it's very hard to think of a visual representation of any future where on film or on television that doesn't have beautiful Hollywood people. And I can't exactly blame Hollywood for this, since I'm watching the beautiful Hollywood people and I'm going, oh yes, that is a good reason to watch the show. Wow, he's hot, she's hot. So I am part of the problem, but I do think that is another thought or consideration in terms of how much of this has been shaped by what we'd like to see on screen.
There are a lot of really fantastic ideas, so I'm trying to keep up with the conversation, but I'm still going back to like, oh, that was really that's an interesting idea. That's you know, I think that the talking about sort of ableism and utopian concepts of utopia, especially as practiced in film, absolutely, that's definitely something which I think finally we're having those conversations. Finally, we're starting to even think about these things. I was just watching Midsummer. This is horror, of course, and not science fiction. And suddenly it just hit me like, this filmmaker who also did Hereditary, there's a lot of ableism in this work. It's really not okay. And he at some point, he's going to be kind of called and held to account for it. But it's really, you know, and I'm really grateful that you guys are bringing that perspective to it. I just wanted to sort of just to share this. I was sort of doing a little bit of research, and no, of course, the Swedes, right, have a lot to. I'm sure have major bones to pick with
Midsommar.
It's well.
Not a bad thing. It's a really nice celebration. I don't know why it got turned into a horror movie. Seriously.
Because I think if this was any other decade, it wouldn't have been Sweden. It would have been somewhere in the southern hemisphere, and it would have been a different thing. And it's just very calculated. Well, the Swedes, what are they going to do? You know, how angry are the Swedes going to be with me? So, but no, I totally take your point. I was looking up and reading about dystopian sort of novels and narratives, and here are the sort of the things that have sort of popped out to me. That are recurring themes in how we conceive of a dystopia. Number one, government control, authoritarianism, fascism, generally speaking. Number two, environmental destruction, you know, the idea of the destruction of the natural world, as has been up to now pretty universally agreed upon to be a terrible thing, although, you know, Now we have another opinion coming to the fore. 3, technological control, right? So another genie in the bottle of unleashing this and what are the ramifications. Of course, the other thing is just survival, right? Just the idea of survival becomes this